The Podski with John Baker. For over...
Cut the music! What I'd like to have for you right now is for all you Podski sweat hogs, keep quiet while you learn about Rick Rude's career. Now hit the intro.
The Podski with John Baker. For over 1 year, the revolutionary force in audio entertainment.
Ooh, yeah!
Brother.
Let me talk to you! Freak out, freak out!
I just had an out-of-body experience!
Insane in the membrane!
Brother.
Yeah! And I'm here for only one reason, and that's to take it to the limit, yeah!
Somebody stop the damn man!
I'm living on the edge.
Who is your daddy?
Hello and welcome to the Podski. I'm your host, Johnny Bakeshow, and ringside with me is Teddy Mongoose. Because of you, the listeners, subscribing to the channel, we are giving you the Rick Rude bonus episode. When a bonus show is unlocked, and the only way you're going to get these bonus shows is if you subscribe to the channel, we'll give you a career spotlight, and we're kicking it off here with Rick Rude. So before we get into the show, I'm going to kick it over to Mongoose, and he's going to give you our format because it's going to be different from any of the regular shows that we do. So, Mongoose, will you give us the format of the show here for the day?
Thank you very much, John. And so this might evolve as the characters that we talk about change. However, I was really inspired by the Dave Meltzer, Owen Hart, Over the Edge 99 career write-up, where he took the show that night and basically wove Owen's career through the show review. Yeah. And like, to me, I was reading on a computer, so it's not like I couldn't put it down, but I didn't want to stop reading it. And so for us to look and see what the format was here, John and I talked, and we thought that it would be a great idea to sort of use that as our mold, where we're basically going to go piece in the timeline, match highlight, piece in the timeline, match highlight, and sort of weave it back and forth that way. It keeps it interesting, not only for us, but for you, the listener. And again, I was really inspired by that Owen write-up. And so I hope that this works out. So please give us feedback. Like it, don't like it. We are men of the people here. You know what I'm saying? So we aren't the smartest guys in the room. We're just trying to sound like it sometimes.
Yes. Make sure that if you are a new listener, subscribe to the channel. That's the best way to support the channel. It also helps us grow. And the more subscribers we get, the more of these bonus shows that we'll do. So we'll also be doing Eddie Guerrero once we get to 500. So if you want to hear Eddie Guerrero, you'll get him at 500, 750. You'll get Scott Hall. When we hit 1,000, we'll get Macho Man. That's what we have in plans right now. To go back into Rick Rude, Rick Rude for me was way before my time. A lot of these Rick Rude matches that we're going to talk about was before I was even born. And for me, I picture him with the briefcase with DX. So I had to really go back in the time machine with these matches to comment on any of them. And all I can say is that I felt like this man was way ahead of his time. The physique, the heel work, the actual in-ring work, way ahead of his time. And one of the reasons that Rude was the first unlockable in this series of unlockables that you can get for the subscriber rewards is because he tragically passed away 25 years ago. We wanted to talk about him in our 99 shows, but there's just so much going on in 99 that we couldn't fit him in. So we felt that he deserved his own show, which is why he is the first bonus show. Teddy, can you please give us your thoughts on Rick Rude because he's more in your time?
Yeah, so I was born in the mid-'80s. So when I was a youngin', Rick Rude was still in his smarmy, heelish glory. Okay, so my first actual memory of Rick Rude was the Masahiro Chono match for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship from Halloween Havoc 1992. The only thing that I cared about on that show was spin the wheel, make the deal. Okay. It is why I got the tape. It is why I would hit play. And I watched that entire pay-per-view probably 50 times from the time that I was, 7 until I was probably 12 or 13, because it was a VHS tape. And back then, brother, you put it on, you watch the whole thing, you put it in a rewinder, and then you put it back in the cabinet. Do you know what I'm saying? So if you wanted to see the main, you needed to stick it out, because that rewind and fast forward wasn't as good of a gimmick as it is, especially now, once the DVDs and everything came into play. I saw that match 1,000 times. And the crazy thing is, I didn't remember anything about that match until the rewatch, when I immediately remembered, oh my gosh, Rick Rude doesn't have a mustache. We'll get to that. And then there's a reason that I didn't really remember anything from that match, is because nothing at all happens in that match. Yes. But I still remembered it, dude. Like, it was just one of those things where, time and place or whatever. So then when I started to get more into wrestling, I dug deeper, going back into the archives, VHS tapes from Blockbuster, video stores. Shouts to Nouveau Video, I believe it was, in the west end of Johnstown in the early 90s. Every time you got a wrestling VHS, they gave you a temporary tattoo to go with it. Yeah, so your boy was covered with like a sleeve before sleeves were a thing. So I saw like Mania 5, Mania 6, SummerSlam 1990, and then this is where I started to get more of the Rick Rude and WCW stuff too. But because I was now a fan and I had an in with a dude that would record pay-per-views, now I was getting your Beach Blasts and some of these other things. So I was able to see all this stuff here. And to pull behind the curtain a little bit, because like this isn't John's fault that he just wasn't born yet. So he said to me, hey, brother, can you shoot me a list of matches? I shot a list over to John of things that like I remembered and things that stuck out to me. Before we even get into any of those, how did I do?
So I am not a big Ultimate Warrior fan. I understand the allure around him. Those Ultimate Warrior matches, like, I really don't think that Ultimate Warrior should have won that cage match.
We'll get to that.
We'll get to that.
We'll get to that.
But I really enjoyed the Steamboat match. I was
going to say, how about the WCW stuff?
That the WCW stuff is so good.
Mm-hmm.
Chono stuff, but the WCW stuff is so much better than what I thought. And I tried to do those watch throughs during COVID of just WCW, and I timed out on it, but I really enjoyed them. They're really good.
Yeah, Rick Rude from late 91 until like mid 93 is a monster.
Yes.
And I can't wait to talk about it, man. But so I'm happy. Like, I was glancing through some of the notes that you took, and I'm not gonna lie, dude, like my heart, I had a little my heart will go on kind of moment here in the Okay, so to get back into this, one thing that I do need to say is that pretty much every wrestling fan in history goes in and out of fandom. I feel like there's like such a small percentage of wrestling fans that started to watch when they were 5 and never stopped when they were 50, right?
It's a very small amount.
So when I first sort of bowed out of my fandom, it was when Sean lost his smile. Mm-hmm. Sean lost his smile. Sean was my guy. He went away. And even though the NWO was a thing and it was gaining steam, it didn't have me enough to like want to watch week to week. And then if I wasn't going to see Sean, I was like, eh. And so the thing with wrestling is once you don't watch one week, it's easy to not watch the second week and the third week and the fourth. And so that happened to me. So then I turned the TV back on, and I'm in middle school now, and it's, some random Monday. And I see Sean is back in the ring with this job guy, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, all right, that I last saw curtsying in the ring. And here's Rick Rude as the Muscle.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, what is this? And so I then Like one of the biggest, and this isn't water cooler because I was literally in middle school, so maybe water fountain. One of the biggest water fountain moments that I had was when Rick Rude is on WCW and WWF TV in the same night.
Yeah.
With a beard and without a beard. And then, we sort of see him fall by the wayside. Some time goes on. And then his, unfortunately, passes away in 1999. So out of the lineup of people that we're going to talk about, they're all great, man. They are. But I think that Rick Rude is an ace to start off with here. There's so much that's going on, and I'm so excited to talk to you about this. And the best thing about this is that I consider myself a Rick Rude fan. And again, I was born in the mid 80s. I saw a lot of the run, and I learned so much going through this. And so I'm really excited to share this with the people too.
Yes, absolutely. Especially with myself, because I'm going to learn some of this in live time as we're going through it. And we're going to kick it off with May 3rd, 1999, which is the Death of Rick Rude edition. So will you please lead us in with the tragic death of Rick Rude?
So Dave Meltzer writes, the death of Rick Rude on 4/20 becomes the latest addition to a strange and macabre body count that has been very close to becoming synonymous with the pro wrestling industry. Rude passed away that evening from a heart attack after being rushed to the North Fulton Medical Center near his home in Alpharetta, Georgia, an Atlanta suburb, at the age of 40. Rude, who was working with WCW as an announcer for the Backstage Blast pay-per-view airings of Nitro on DirecTV once per month, after being removed from his role as childhood friend Curt Hennig's on-camera manager, had been training for an in-ring comeback after his career presumably had ended after suffering a broken back in a May 1st, 1994 match against Sting at Fukuoka Dome. Rude's death becomes the 25th known death of an active pro wrestling personality over the last 6 years. So that was between 93 and mid-99. Wow. 25th pro wrestling death. And the 6th death of someone actively participating in the business so far in 1999.
Man.
So Rude's death was the 6th of active participants from January until April.
That's sad.
99.
Even there's more to come. Literally a month later.
So Rude, whose legal name was Richard Irwin Rood, and that's Rood, had a friendship with Hennig that dated back to childhood. His father Dick and Kurt's father Larry, a famous pro wrestler of a generation ago, were also longtime friends. Rude and Hennig attended Robbinsdale High School near Minneapolis together. On the day of Rick Rude's death, that afternoon, Rick had taken his 8-year-old son to school, attended a martial arts class, and went out to hit some golf balls. At about 5 p.m., his wife returned from shopping and found him on the floor, barely breathing with a light pulse. She called 911, and he was revived briefly in the ambulance before going into a coma and suffering cardiac arrest at the hospital. The heart attack is being investigated as a possible drug overdose. There were empty prescription pill bottles found near his bed. And the Wikipedia had said afterwards, Rude was found unconscious by his wife and died on the morning of April 20th, 1999, at the age of 40, when he suffered from heart failure. An autopsy report showed he died from an overdose of, quote, mixed medications. Nobody seemingly saw this particular incident coming, although incidents like this are no longer unexpected. Due to a wrestling public that has been numbed with the frequency of out-of-the-ring incidents that at one time in this sport and even today in any other sport would have been considered alarming, are now considered regular weekly occurrences. A wrestling star, even one of the biggest names from a past era, dying at a young age is no longer surprising or shocking to the wrestling public at large. The big picture, in many cases, the 3 children and a wife left behind, which is another pattern of many of these deaths, will be forgotten as people attempt to circumvent what they fear may be the bigger truth and hide from bad publicity, because this may be another case of being too much of a regular pattern. And I should note that one of the first wrestling books that I ever read was The Squared Circle by, Dave Shoemaker might be the name. And he came to prominence because he was a Deadspin writer. He was the guy that did the Dead Wrestler of the Week.
Oh.
Great book, man. Yeah, great book. Like it is one to check out. It literally takes you through. That was sort of where I learned about women's troop and sort of like the vileness of your mullahs and whatnot. But it goes from the Carney days up to probably like the early 2000s. It's a really good read. But yeah, he literally came to prominence being the writer that did, quote, Dead Wrestler of the Week.
Wow. Okay.
So, John, we start low. Okay, we do. We start low. Yeah, we're going to bring you up. So, to bridge us, will you please take us through Rick Rude's title history?
Yes, so we are going to go in reverse order of championships that he won. We're going to start with the most recent one that he won, which was the WCW International World Heavyweight Championship. He won that 3 times. He defeated Ric Flair, Hiroshi Hase, and Sting. And the Sting match is where he suffered the broken back during the match and where he ended up quitting WCW. And we'll talk about that later on. He also won the WCW United States Heavyweight Championship. He won that 1 time and he defeated Sting. So again, the Sting and Rude stuff is really good here.
Dave says that it's the best feud of 91-92. And it should be noted that because Rude turned into a bump machine, this is where the injuries start to pile up. And to piggyback off of what you just said, he actually vacates that U.S. title due to injury.
Yes.
So
never lost.
I'm undefeated, never lost.
WWF Intercontinental Championship. He won that 1 time and he defeated the Ultimate Warrior. NWA World Tag Team Championship. He won that 1 time with tag team member Manny Fernandez. In World Class Championship Wrestling, he held the World Class Wrestling Association World Heavyweight title 1 time, the World Class American Heavyweight title, and he also won the World Class TV title 1 time.
And the fun fact there we'll get to is that the World Class American Heavyweight title was renamed the World Class Wrestling Association World Heavyweight Championship after a falling out with the NWA.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
In other territories where he won championships, he won the NWA Southern Heavyweight title, which is the Florida version. He won that 1 time. He won the NWA US Tag Team titles with tag team partner Jesse Barr. Southern Heavyweight Championship. He defeated Jerry Lawler in this one, so that's a pretty interesting one. Southern Tag Team Champions with King Kong Bundy. And last but not least, the Observer Awards. He won Best Heel in 1992. And then also in 1992, he won the Worst Match of the Year versus Masahiro Chono, October 25th in Philadelphia, which this is Halloween Havoc 92.
Unfortunately, this is Halloween Havoc 1992. I say this is the match that I remember, and then I read that this won Worst Match of the Year, and I was like, wow, that was a thing. All right. So Richard Rude was born December 7th, 1958. Grew up in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. After high school, he was working as a bouncer and was considered the toughest bar worker in the northeastern section of Minneapolis, along with, check this out, Road Warrior Animal, Road Warrior Hawk, and Barry Darsow, who is Demolition Smash or the Repo Man, the Blacktop Bully, however you might remember him.
That's awesome.
So he was considered to be the toughest of the 4, even though he was the lightest, and was noted for being so powerful that he was able to knock people out with an open-handed slap. Years later, while in pro wrestling, he knocked out the 400-pound PN News.
Yo, baby, yo!
While the 2 had a problem with 1 open-handed slap.
Wow.
He credited his physique to his genetics, 6'4", thin legs, and a long, thin torso. He also had incredible grip strength. He was a noted arm wrestler, finishing 6th in the World Championships held in Las Vegas in the light heavyweight division in 1983 after placing 2nd in the U.S. Nationals in 1980. You can talk about this guy and that guy being a shooter, noted Eddie Sharkey, who trained Rick Rude, Barry Darsow, the Road Warriors, Nikita Koloff, and other numerous pro wrestlers. Quote, but this guy kicked more ass than any of them. People didn't realize how tough this guy was. Nobody could come close to him. He'd slap guys with an open hand and it looked like their head exploded. End quote.
Wow.
Sharkey also noted that Rude was so strong at arm wrestling that he was able to put down Hawk, who was a much larger man at this time, even allowing Hawk to use both arms against one of his.
This is
Dude, this I don't know, man. This smells so pro wrestling, but I love it anyways. I don't even care.
I'm sucked in. I'm so sucked in Rude right now.
So Rude is of the famous Minnesota lineage from the early 80s. So all these names came through the territories in the AWA in the early 1980s. So you have the Crusher, Vern Gagne, Baron Von Raschke, Bobby Heenan, Mad Dog Vachon, Nick Bockwinkel, Jesse Ventura, Hulk Hogan, and then the other four that I just mentioned. So, like, times are good right now in the AWA.
For real.
So because of this, it was natural for young, tough gym rats and bouncers to think about pro wrestling more than any other parts of the country. So, again, those names that I just mentioned, Crusher through Hogan, inspired your Rudes, your Laurinaitis, your Hawks, those types to get into wrestling. So in 1981, Rude was training for a tough man contest under a local promoter who had ties to both the city's boxing and pro wrestling community. He had a 2-0 record as an amateur boxer. Some say he could have made a lot of money as a boxer, but he and all others around him gravitated toward pro wrestling because it made a lot more money. He had no money at the time, so he got his friends to loan him the money to pay for his training under Sharkey. He broke into wrestling and often barely had enough money for gas to get to his matches and would sleep in his car. And dude, these little things, this is what sort of pulls at me. When he became a money player in pro wrestling, he paid everyone back, which is awesome, dude.
That is awesome. That is
So years later, when Sharkey was down on his luck after serving a term in prison and was working as a referee for the WWF, Ravishing Rick Rude was then a headliner. He showed up at the card in Minneapolis and gave Sharkey a bag filled with $3,000 in cash. Rude and Hawk were being trained by Sharkey to be a tag team, and so we're flipping back to the early 80s here. So Rude and Hawk were being trained by Sharkey to be a tag team when Sharkey invited Ole Anderson, who was running Georgia Championship Wrestling Incorporated, which had the best national television exposure in the country on WTBS about a year before Vince McMahon took the WWF National, up to his camp. Rude, Animal, and Hawk all started around the same time and all nearly quit together, but Sharkey urged them to stick it out. A few months later, Anderson, who was grooming a young tag team of Arn Anderson and Matt Bourne to be his top heel combination, so Arn and Doink, saw Bourne get arrested on a sexual assault charge and have to leave the territory. Ole needed a team in a hurry, and Sharkey recommended Rude and Hegstrand, which is Hawk.
Mm-hmm.
Ole had just seen the movie The Road Warrior a week or two earlier and wanted a huge bodybuilder to play the role. And in late 1982, picked Laurinaitis for that role. Using the Road Warrior's gimmick, and Bill Watts later came up with the idea for the face paint, the two were immediate sensations. A few weeks later, Anderson, starving for new talent, brought Rude and Darsow in. Rude was given a minor push at the beginning, miscast because of his looks, not recognizing he had a certain attitude that made him a natural heel, as a babyface with the gimmick of, quote, the toughest bouncer in Minneapolis, who is a former arm wrestling champion. Way to be creative.
Yeah, really. They really dug into the box of gimmicks there for that one.
And this was done to feud with then national heavyweight champion Larry Zbyszko. He didn't last long in Georgia and was sent to work briefly for Jim Crockett in the Carolinas as Jobber Ricky Rude. Later, Bill Watts in the Mid-South Territory as a good-looking undercard babyface, which also faltered. Watts had nothing for him either, but it was, Jerry Jarrett who made him a star. In 1984, Watts brought Bill Dundee in as a booker, who in turn added the Rock and Roll Express, Bobby Eaton, and Dennis Condrey, who formed a tag team called the Midnight Express. Terry Taylor and Jim Cornette, among others from Memphis that Dundee and Watts saw a lot of potential in, although they succeeded probably beyond either's expectations as it led to the hottest run the territory would ever have. Watts sent Jarrett a few wrestlers that he had no more use for in exchange since he was adding so much new talent, Rude, King Kong Bundy, and Jim Neidhart being the most notable.
Wow.
Man, Jim Neidhart was always a bridesmaid, wasn't he?
Yeah, he always was. Dang.
Like, you go through that list, man. Always a bridesmaid, never the bride. But you know what, dude? Dude was good enough to be in the business for a long time because we're talking mid-'80s here, and he has that run the whole way through the New Heart Foundation.
It's true.
So with only about 1 year full-time in the business and never having been given a serious push, this is so awesome, dude. Jerry Jarrett, bless the child, brother. Jarrett changes his name to, quote, Ravishing Rick Rude, end quote, gives him the popular song Smooth Operator as his ring music, and that followed him around the territories until his WWF days, and he was given a monstrous heel push with Valet Angel, playing the role that he continued to play throughout his active career. At the time, Rude wasn't particularly good in the ring. And although since most of his main events were against Lawler, who at the time was somebody that could carry anybody, there was no problem with him headlining. But then whenever he faced less talented guys like Austin Idol, his weaknesses were becoming somewhat apparent. This is so crazy to read too. His interviews weren't polished either. So like to think about Rick Rude not being able to talk is wild.
For real. That is really crazy to think about because he seems so polished whenever you see him.
And so Dave says there was potential there because there was great delivery, but there was no creativity. He had a strong delivery and an arrogant personality that made people believe that he truly hated opponents like Jerry Lawler, Austin Idol, Randy Savage, the fabulous ones, and people hated him for it. So he, in his first territory as a headliner, begins to generate unusually great heat. Okay? So now he's learning how to work the stick. And the look helps, obviously, right?
Right.
So Dave says he has a few traits that couldn't be taught that made him one of the great heels of his time. So these are Dave's words. Dave says he has movie star looks. He has a unique chiseled physique. He was a tall, very tough man, and he knew it. And he had the confidence and arrogance to go along with it. And he became a natural in displaying those qualities all in front of the camera. And dude, before we even go on, check. Like,
for real.
Rick Rude, you want to talk about anybody that could ever look as good as he does with that caterpillar above the top lip?
Oh, big fat caterpillar. It looks
and it looks so right. Yeah. Dude, even when he shaved it, he still looked great. Yeah. He had that just thick man beard. You know what I'm saying? When he started carrying the briefcase around, like, a dude looked good with a perm. Ain't many of us out there that look good with a perm.
It is true. It is valid.
So Rude had memorable programs during a period when Jarrett's business was extremely strong, working as the main heel in the company for several months, being managed by Jimmy Hart, and frequently teaming with King Kong Bundy. And so here we take a time out. John, would you take us through our first match highlight?
Yes, this is a match that I found on YouTube, and I'm going to put the link in the description below. So this is a match that I found from MSG in 1989. It's Rick Rude versus Roddy Piper. You gave me a list of matches, but you also said, find me one banger that's not on the list. And I feel like I found it. This was not televised. This was just a regular show that was put out there on YouTube. And all I got to say is this crowd was nuclear. Rude had legitimate heat. And the match was so much fun. Rude starts off with saying, I don't know whether or not if I should fight you or kiss you because Roddy Piper's got the skirt on. They end up battling with each other and the skirt comes off, but Roddy Piper pulls out the belt, but then Rude gets a hold of it and he starts whipping Roddy with it. Then Roddy gets it and starts smacking Rude with it. It was so much fun. The only thing I will say about this, and this is the thing I'm going to say continuously through the Rick Rude matches, dude loves a rest hold. And I mean loves a rest hold. The only thing that sucked was the finish out of this. Rude was trying to get away. Roddy followed him. They called it a disqualification because of a double count out. But we did get some post match action with Roddy bringing Rude back to the ring, and then they started hitting him with chairs. Rude ended up grabbing the chair and getting one off on Piper, and then he hurried up and rolled out of the ring, and that was the end of the match. But it was so much fun to watch this match.
And here's your context, because you found this one, and I can give you the reason for the finish is they run it back with the cage match later in the year. So the reason for the double count out is to put him in a cage later on. So with context, it makes sense.
Makes sense.
Yep. So his next stop's in Florida. Dory Funk is the booker. This is like a who's who, man, of just names, right?
Just hitting all the highlights here.
You better, and this is like the glory time too, where all these things were forged. So Rude has a good look, but the territory was based more on in-ring performance. Because of this, he's paired with tag team partner Jesse Barr, a worker that Funk really liked and thought that he was going to be a future superstar. Dave calls this team, quote, the Florida version of Jesse Ventura and Adrian Adonis, pairing the colorful guy with the great physique with a more ordinary looking guy who was a great worker to handle the bulk of the in-ring work, end quote. Thought that was a pretty cool allegory. Never saw these two work together, but giving that context, that makes a lot of sense.
It does.
So even with those in-ring limitations, which is still weird to say this sentence out loud, right? About Rick Rude being limited in the ring.
Right.
Rude was put on top as the Southern Heavyweight Champion, with his most notable feud being with Wahoo McDaniel. Dave says there was apparently a real-life dust-up between the two, and Wahoo, who was in his 40s at the time, chose not to engage in confrontation, which apparently was something that Wahoo didn't do. Like, if you had a problem with Wahoo, Wahoo's the one with the story about the gun and with the pistol whipping or whatever. Like, so he was a crazy man.
All those big meat hooks on the end of those Rude arms, and he didn't want none of them.
Yep. And so Dave said that this helped the backstage lore of Rick Rude grow. That this dude's a legit BA. And so this gained him credibility to get guys to do jobs for him later on, et cetera, because he was a real life tough guy.
Makes sense.
Doesn't work with a big yellow tan man that we're going to find later on. Big yellow haired tan man.
That doesn't work for me, brother.
Exactly. Rick also met his future wife, who he married 3 years later while working out of Tampa. His next stop was in Texas, starting in late 1985 for World Class Championship Wrestling, where, as a trivia note, he became the first ever WCWA World Heavyweight Champion. He was the American Heavyweight Champion at the time that Jim Crockett made it very difficult for other promotions to book Ric Flair, who at the time was the NWA Champion. Because he was planning to tour nationally using Ric Flair as the top star, he needed Flair for new markets, so he made it tough to book Flair. So in response, Fritz von Erich, who was the head of the Dallas office, decided to withdraw from the NWA, and in doing so, elevated the American title, which Rude held, to a world title. Rude headlined against all the Von Erichs, along the likes of Bruiser Brody and Chris Adams, who he just had a dark side of the ring, by the way. I heard it was pretty good. During the run that lasted until late 1986. Dave says on the biggest show to that point in his career, he worked a semi-main event on the May 4th, 1986 show in Texas Stadium that drew 24,121 fans, paying $193,108 in 1986 dollars.
That's big money.
$200,000 house in 1986, dude. And he defended the WCWA title, winning via DQ against Bruiser Brody. And then Dave says this was the last true big money show in the history of that territory. So during that year, and this is just, again, Murderer's Row, dude. During that year, he was managed by, and these are Dave's words, not only a much slimmer Percy Pringle, who was Paul Bearer, but also had a red-haired female valet named Raven with a bodybuilder look, which it was never acknowledged at the time, but in real life was his sister.
Oh, that's interesting.
So Rick Rude was managed by Jimmy Hart, Percy Pringle, and then his sister at this point in time.
That's really
And then he goes on to have banger after banger, because then he's going to get Bobby Heenan and Paul Heyman. But and it's so crazy that he has all these insane managers, and this dude is such a good talker.
Yes, that is true.
All right, man. So that's a nice little break in territories. So before we jump on to the next one, would you take us through match highlight number 2?
I can do that. So we'll start with the first match, which is at WrestleMania 5 between Rick Rude and the Ultimate Warrior. And holy cow, what a match of the gears. The gear for both is amazing. And also, I have written that Rick Rude should have gotten paid at minimum $10,000 more for his selling.
Dude, Black Boots Warrior is awesome.
It is.
Awesome look. Black Boots Warrior is like White Boots Triple H.
Yes. Great call. The pile driver and the top rope drop kick were so awesome. And especially to see this, especially at some point in like WrestleMania 5, you don't expect high flying, good moves like that. So that was really refreshing to see. And the way that Heenan was used in the finish, and they teased it early on, was so like a chef's kiss.
The Weasel. He was a weasel in that match, man. It's a weaselly finish. You're right.
Yes. Rude and Heenan together are like a match made in heaven. They're perfect. Our second match goes to SummerSlam 90, which is Rude versus Warrior. And I thought I heard this while I was watching.
Oh, you did?
We got Tony Schiavone on the call here with Jesse. And the finishing sequence is Rude hitting a jumping knuckle driver. Yes, we literally made that up here on the Podski.
Shots to Granny. I feel like that's something Granny would call that.
Yes. So the jumping knuckle driver is from the top rope. Warrior kicks out. Piper walks out at the kick out, and the place is going nuts. There's a pile driver by Rick Rude, a kick out. Rude poses for Piper. Piper moons him. Rude is furious. Goes up to the second rope. Warrior comes up from behind. Gives Rick Rude a German from the second rope. He shakes the ropes, shoulder tackle, gorilla press, splash. Schiavone is going nuts on the call. This match is fine, but the finishing sequence and Schiavone on the call are so good. And this match leads to the Piper match that we just talked about. So then we get the Rude versus Ultimate Warrior, SummerSlam 90 in steel cage. The Pennsylvania Pissants made me so happy when he said that. I couldn't believe that he jumped off the top of the cage, but he did it a second time. Rude being pulled by his hands and feet by Heenan and Warrior was such a great spot. It was a great way to neutralize Heenan, but this one, it ended so abruptly and it felt so anticlimactic. The press, the climb, boom, it's over. It just felt like there was just something missing.
I don't think you're wrong there. I really don't. That match is among late 30s, early 40s people. That match matters a lot because it was the Warrior that was in his first real headlining pay-per-view against an all-time heel, and it's in a cage. Do you know what I'm saying? So there's a lot of, and we still haven't seen Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart yet as a WWF audience, quote unquote. So everybody that's watching Ric Flair and all them go crazy, the closest thing we have to this is macho matches, basically. And we don't even get to see Macho and Warrior yet, or some of the great work that Mach does later on. And so that's why I think that your vision is clouded and mine too. Do you know what I'm saying? So I think that's sort of objectively, this isn't very good. But to give you the context, I think that's why people hold it in such high regard.
Yes, and we can talk about that when we get to 1,000 subscribers. So all the more reason to subscribe to the Podski here and get us over the hump so that we can talk about Randy Macho Man Savage.
You got it. All right, man. So next hop on the territories. The next stop was Crockett's office, which at this point had just gotten the TBS contract and thus was Vince McMahon's only national competitor during the late 80s. So Rick Rude arrived in late 1986 and immediately was programmed as a mid-card heel feuding with his old rival, Wahoo McDaniel. Eventually, he's put together in a heel tag team with Manny Fernandez, who had just turned on Dusty Rhodes. So I don't really know Manny Fernandez, and to provide context to people that are out there, this is Dusty in the mid-'80s. So when his partner turns on him, we got a nuclear tag team, right? So the two were then managed by Paul Jones, not the Penn State quarterback. They spent several months feuding with the Rock and Roll Express over the NWA World Tag Team titles, which Rude and Fernandez quickly won since the Express was better in the role of chasing the belts rather than holding them and feuding with the heel team that needed the championships for the sake of rep. In May 1987, Rude, without giving notice or dropping the belts, Dave says this wasn't unusual in these days because wrestling contracts were basically all handshake deals, and there was a brutal wrestling war at that time because WWF just went national.
Yep.
Rude left JCP while holding one half of their tag team titles. Clumsily, they announced on TBS that Rude had been injured and that Ivan Koloff was replacing him on the championship team. And then Dave says it got even weirder because about a week later, Fernandez walked out on the promotion as well. So this is the hashtag That's So WCW before WCW even exists.
Yes.
Eventually, this was settled by JCP airing a tape of a match that was taped months earlier in Columbia, South Carolina, but was announced on television that it had taken place on May 26, 1987 in Spokane, Washington, which was a city that JCP wasn't even running, where the Rock and Roll Express had won. The actual match was, at the time, a non-title match taped for a Japanese World Pro Wrestling television show and was labeled as the title change, which was a clumsy scenario since they aired Rude competing after announcing that he was so badly injured that he needed to be replaced and wasn't coming back. But you know what? It's pro wrestling, right? And I hate to say it, but you have a really forgiving audience.
Yes.
All right, man. So before we hop, so Rude just went from JCP to WWF. Before we make that jump on our timeline, hit us up with match highlight number 3.
Yes, match highlight number 3 is Beach Blast 92, and this is WCW. It is Rick Rude versus Ricky Steamboat. I have 2 world-class athletes in a 30-minute IronMan match. Sign me up. I thought that it was smart how Steamboat left his son in the ring to start the match so Rude wouldn't be able to attack him early. Hot start to this one, but Rude gets the first pinfall after being thrown into the corner and hitting a running Steamboat with a flying knee to the head. This quickly was followed up by a Rude awakening, and Rude goes up 2-0 within the first 10 minutes.
Really quick, dude. This is one of my biggest problems with Iron Man matches, and this is what's so smart, is that I remember being a child and seeing Ricky get pinned, and then Rude picks him right up and gives him Rude awakening. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what if he does this 15 more times?
That's what we should have done.
But that was so smart, man. It was really to go back to back. And then Jesse's on the call on this one, right?
Yes.
Jesse's saying about how smart this is, Rick Rude, blah, blah. Like, this is awesome.
It is awesome. Beach blasts are so great.
Yes.
We're hoping to slide some beach blasts into the calendar here. So Rude came off the top rope with a knee to the head, and it was called as a DQ since top rope maneuvers were banned. So it's 2-1. But Rude quickly pins Steamboat, which negates that point by Steamboat. So now Rude is up 3-1. Rude delivered a pile driver for a near fall. What a beautiful pile driver this dude has.
Oh yeah, baby.
It is good. Rude then tried for the tombstone, but it was reversed into his own tombstone for a pin. So it's 3-2 Steamboat. Where do we see that later on down the wrestling timeline? So we're 20 minutes into the match. Both men are exhausted, but Steamboat gets a quick pin on Rude and he ties it up. They battle for the last 7 minutes and Steamboat hits his own Rude awakening on Rick Rude, but there was a rope break. Rude followed that up with a long sleeper hold where Ricky
Rest hold, baby. Rest hold Jones.
rest hold city. He holds that in where Ricky finally pushes off the top rope. Please see Bret Hart, Roddy Piper, finish of WrestleMania 8. And he gets the pin and he goes up 4-3. Rude spent the last 30 seconds running around like the Ultimate Warrior trying to get a pin, but it wasn't enough. This was awesome. If that's not a 5-star match, I don't know what is.
I love that you thought that this was great, man. I do. And I didn't have a chance to comb through the observers at recording time. You could throw them on the screen. We'll see what we can find, and you could throw them on the screen then to give the actual Dave ratings here. But this match is great. And the only thing better than this is that they run it back a year later. It's not as good with Dustin. We'll get to that. But this is great, man. Love me some 30-minute Ironmans with falls. That's the best thing about Ironmans is when you have falls. So
the sweet spot is about 4 to 6 falls.
Yep, I'm glad you enjoyed, brother. Okay, so we are now in the WWF. This is the land of the giants. And the whispers were that Rick Rude would have a ceiling when he came to New York because, I'm going to go through the checklist. 1, his physique wasn't, quote, thick or bulky enough, end quote. And, dude, this guy's a top 5 physique ever.
Seriously.
Like,
it's chiseled from stone.
Yep. 2, his in-ring talents were limited. And then Dave says that a few things happened to change that. First, he got even more heavily into steroids so that his size-wise, he would match up with most of the main events.
Yeah.
Still, because of his natural thin frame, even bulked up, he was never considered to have enough weight for a program with main man Hulk Hogan, even though he was a stronger heel than a majority of the men that Hogan was programmed with. And I also noted that this was the real-life ceiling of his buddy Kurt Hennig.
Yeah.
That Perfect wasn't able to get there either. They would only do, I think Saturday Night's Main Event was as high as Kurt got with Hulk Hogan.
Yeah.
So Dave said he was packaged as more of a stripper type. My fun fact here is the original character of Val Venus was based on being the modernized version of Rick Rude. With the swivel hips and the pelvic thrust, he became a human catchphrase a decade before the business revolved around them. What I'd like to have right now is for all you fat, out of shape, insert city, sweat hogs to take a look at what a real man is supposed to look like as he'd open his robe, heavily flexing his arms and abs, generally to thunderous boos. Rude was not an instant success in WWF. He languished in the undercards for several months until coming up with the catchphrase entrance and hitting it big with his first program and perhaps his most memorable of all with Jake Roberts. The program started whenever he hit on Roberts' wife Cheryl in an angle that was years ahead of its time. Even though Roberts pinned Rude every night, everywhere, Rude's arrogance was such that he continued to get great heat everywhere he went and got over even stronger. The feud continued through most of 1988, eventually with Rick Rude being managed by Bobby Heenan. Rude's arrogance in the ring was such that, as great a heel as he was in territories, every attempt to turn him face fizzled. The irony is that during his active career, Rude was never a success as a babyface anywhere, but was successful as a heel everywhere. So the hotter the heel, the hotter the babyface did not work for Rick Rude.
That's why he feels like the exception.
Here's where Dave just jams the javelin into the dirt. If that same character came along now, and this is 1999, he would be a huge babyface.
You're right. He would be.
So the most hated man in wrestling for like a 7-year span. And he literally would have been the biggest babyface ever, 1999 until today.
Absolutely would have
for
been. 25
years. So along with Roberts, the other big program in his WWF era was with the Ultimate Warrior. Rude scored one of the first and only of the exceedingly few pinfalls ever on Warrior in his WWF tenure when Rude won the Intercontinental title on April 2nd, 1989 at WrestleMania 5 in Atlantic City. This led to Warrior regaining the belt at the second SummerSlam on August 28th, 1989 at the Meadowlands Arena as the second match from the top beneath Hogan. By this point, Rude had upped his work rate to where he became almost a bumping machine, which led to him being able to be one of the few who could get a good match out of Warrior. About the only others were Savage and Ted DiBiase, two of the best workers of the era. Of course, this also led to numerous injuries and ultimately an early retirement. After Warrior had captured the WWF title at WrestleMania 6 from Hulk Hogan at Toronto's Skydome, Rude, who had largely feuded with Dusty Rhodes, was elevated to the top of the card, with the storyline being that he was the one who had beaten Warrior for the IC title. And this climax with Warrior winning a cage match in the main event of SummerSlam on August 27th, 1990 in Philadelphia before a sellout 19,304 fans and drawing a buy rate of 3.8. As it turned out, get ready for this, bro. This was the only pay-per-view show he ever headlined as a single.
That's crazy. That's literally crazy to think about.
That's it. He headlined one other pay-per-view show, May 17th, 1992, WCW Wrestle War from Jacksonville, Florida, in a War Games match where the Dangerous Alliance, which was himself, Arn Anderson, Bobby Eaton, Steve Austin, and Larry Zbyszko, lost to Sting, Nikita Koloff, Dustin Rhodes, Ricky Steamboat, and Barry Windham before 6,000 fans in a match or an event that drew a 0.6 buy rate. His WWF career ended shortly after his SummerSlam main event after a dispute with Vince McMahon. While out of commission with a torn tricep, the WWF continued to advertise him for a house show run against the Warrior in the main event. Business was disappointing during this period as the Warrior was a weaker than expected draw as a champion after Hogan. Rude was still advertised as the heel challenging for the title in all the top arenas. Rude felt that his name was being used to draw houses. However, McMahon was paying him very little based on the fact that he wasn't wrestling on those shows. And in those days, before there was significant guaranteed money contracts, injured wrestlers were not paid until they got back into action. He eventually quit the company over that dispute, over not getting paid main event money for those shows. As was the case at the time, even after quitting, the WWF continued to advertise him as appearing on shows as a headliner for over another month, including some markets billing him as appearing on the shows where advertising had not even gone out until after he had quit. Dave spoke with JJ Dillon at that time about the problem, and JJ's response was that since the WWF felt that Rick Rude's contract hadn't expired, and since the official release wasn't signed, that they had the right to advertise him to appear, even knowing full well that he had quit, on the guise that, quote, who knows, he may come back, and at that point, it wouldn't be false advertising, end quote. I do want to end the WWF run with Michelle Rude, who was Rick Rude's wife, said, Vince had always treated my husband very well. He goes by talent. Some other promoters didn't go by talent, and Rick spoke what he felt. A lot of promoters didn't like that. Vince respected that and understood that. Others didn't and held it against him. All right, man. So we have closed the book on Rick Rude's WWF chapter, but before we move on to the next, John, would you please bless us with the double feature? Literally a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde of two matches between Rick Rude and Masahiro Chono.
Yes. Okay. So we have the Rude versus Chono, the double feature here. The first match was August 12th of 1992 in the G1 Climax tournament. So this is over in New Japan. So Rude comes to the ring with Medusa. The crowd is nuclear. Dusty Rhodes is sitting straight on the hard cam for this match, suited and booted. Rude does an awesome flare-style face plant right in the middle of the ring after a clothesline exchange. Chono swings his hips like Rude, and the crowd was eating it up. They trade strikes and holds. Chono puts Rude in a sleeper. Rude drops and gives Chono a chin buster. They set up for the same spot a few minutes later, but this time, when Rude drops, Chono doesn't. Rude starts selling his frustration with a mini tantrum, and Chono immediately puts him back in the hold. It was awesome. Chono then works over Rude's knee. Rude is, like we've said multiple times here on the show, Rude's selling is so good. His selling was excellent here. Chono gets Rude in the figure four, and Rude was able to reverse the pressure. This spot over the years done way too many times, but
it's a lost art, man. It's a lost art. There was so many times when I was growing up, Flair, especially because of heel Flair, would have you in the figure four, and when they would start to turn it, and he would be selling, no. It was awesome to see this one get turned and then actually reverse the pressure. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like that's a lost art.
It is like, it used to be such a big spot, and now I just feel like they don't do it anymore. As soon as they get into the figure four, they just got to hold it in, and that's it. And then they break it out, and then they're done. They don't flip back and forth anymore.
It'll come back though. What's old is new again. Same way where I begged for 30 years, me and friend of the pod, Brix Malone, who I will body slam before the end of 2024, whether he sandbags me or not. We talked all the time about how much I loved the 10 count punches. 1, 2, 3. That's back, dude. It's back, and it's back in full force. So I have confidence that we'll see the reversing pressure come back.
Bring back the reversing pressure. Rude goes to the top. He's still selling his knee. Chono gives him a flare slam off the top rope. Chono then works over Rude's shoulder. Rude cuts him off and then gets big time heat on Chono. This was a great back and forth. Rude cuts off Chono every time he starts his comeback. Rude hits a missile drop kick for a big near fall. Immediately hits Chono with a DDT, and the crowd goes insane for the kick out. They trade suplexes. Chono reverses a tombstone and plants Rude for another big near fall. Really heated down the stretch. Chono gets Rude in an STF. Rude gets out, hits a pile driver. Rude then goes up to the top, hits the big knee, and Chono kicks out at 1. Chono hits his big comeback, gets some quick near falls on Rude. Rude throws Chono to the outside. Chono immediately climbs to the top, hits a diving shoulder tackle on Rude for the 3 count. Not only is Chono your G1 Climax winner, he is your new NWA World Champion. This match was awesome. Dave Meltzer gives it 4.5 stars. It gets an 8.36 on Cage Match. Please go check it out. We'll leave it in the description below. But Mongoose, before we move on to the next match here, would you please give us a quick rundown of how the NWA Championship was on the line at the G1 tournament?
Yeah, absolutely. This whole situation could probably be a show on its own. But the quick rundown here for people that don't have the context is that Ric Flair is the WCW but not NWA champion after the WCW didn't recognize Tatsumi Fujinami beating Ric Flair in Japan because of an over-the-top rope backdrop in a match that was held there. So at the time, WCW had rules with no moves over the top rope, et cetera, et cetera. And because of this, their rules, they wanted to keep kayfabe alive. They didn't want to allow a title change under their jurisdiction with something that obviously violated those rules. Ric Flair unifies the belts in May, but then he starts having trouble with Jim Herd. So there is creative differences. We've all heard the stories about, Herd wanted him to cut his hair and, be Spartacus and this, that, and the other thing. And so Flair says, I've had enough of this. I'm out of here. So he leaves the WCW in July. And this was actually right before, I believe it was the Great American Bash pay-per-view. He then signs with the WWF in August 1991. And the fun little story here is that because he left and didn't return the belt, the WCW needed a title belt to give to the new champion. I don't have the note in front of me. I believe it was Luger. If I'm wrong, kill me in the comments if you need to. But they literally essentially stapled on WCW champion onto one of Dusty's old FCW championships.
Yes.
So that was the placeholder belt that they used there. So Flair is now in the WWF as of August 91. He is still, however, the NWA champ at the time. And the reason why is the NWA is its own booking authority. And so because they didn't approve him to leave, drop the belt, et cetera, the WCW was able to strip him of the WCW belt. NWA, he actually was the champion until September 8th. This is one of the reasons why he was able to go to the WWF with the strap. The other reason is that Flair kept the belt because Jim Herd wouldn't give him back the $25,000 deposit that he put down on the belt.
Yeah.
So if you did not know, if you were not privy, at that time in the NWA, if you were the champion, you were required to put down a $25,000 deposit because you held the belt. You were the face of not only the company, but I mean, the actual association at that time. And so that was essentially your stakes in the game to not screw it up. And Jim Herd wouldn't give Flair that money back. And so Flair said, well, bleep you, I'm keeping your title.
Yep.
And so, the NWA strips him on September 8th, and there is no NWA champion until WCW, New Japan, and the NWA revive it for this interpromotional WCW versus New Japan tournament. It happened to be the second ever G1 Climax. This wasn't the second ever tournament that was held there. There was the International Wrestling Grand Prix and everything else in the 80s, but this was the official, second official G1. And the winner of this one was actually crowned your NWA champion. So Chono won this tournament for a vacant championship and the G1 tournament.
Okay, that all makes sense of why when we get to the next match here at Halloween Havoc, why he even has the belt. And so that all adds up.
And John, you're going to review, and then I'm going to slap you with some context. So just so you know, while you're going through this, don't bury Chono too bad.
Okay.
Okay? Just don't bury him too bad. All right, go ahead.
Not to. It's going to be hard. The second half of the double feature that we're going to do here is WCW Halloween Havoc 1992. I immediately wrote, where is the stash? I immediately knew something was going to be wrong with this match when he didn't have the stash.
You're right, but he still looks so good without it.
He does still look good. The pre-match with the two refs thing, it was too much. Of course, Ole was out there directing traffic for that. The immediate want Flair chant basically sums up this entire match. This absolutely sucked. The finish was confusing. Too many rest holds. And that is what I'm glad you gave context for the NWA thing, because my last sentence was, I can't believe this was for the NWA world title.
Yeah. So what do you got here for review wise, John?
So this is the match that we talked about early on, where this is the worst match of the year, according to the Observer, for 1992. And it also got a 2.951 cage match. So this match absolutely sucks.
This is where I'm happy to provide a little bit of context, because in juxtaposing how good the G1 match is with how bad the Halloween Havoc match is, here we go. So again, we pick up with Rude's career with him leaving the WWF. So Rick Rude worked independents in All Japan, where Giant Baba wouldn't allow him to do his pre-match mic work or his stripper dance, and where his punch kick offense and his thin build didn't get him over past a mid-level foreigner. But fans did get into his personality that he was allowed to show and accepted him as a acceptable mid-card performer until his WWF contract expired. His style wasn't considered Japan-friendly, although he proved that wrong, as he did very well in New Japan on big shows over the next 2 years after he signed with WCW. After his WWF deal expired on October 27, 1991, he debuted with WCW under a mask as the Halloween Phantom, using the Rude Awakening on Tom Zink in 1 minute and 27 seconds, and got a mega push. 3 weeks later, on a televised Clash of the Champions, he captured the U.S. title from Sting due to outside interference from Lex Luger, beginning the last memorable feud of his active career, and one which left very bitter feelings since Rude blamed Sting for his career-ending injury nearly 3 years later. A little bit of foreshadowing there.
Gotcha.
So without question, his career peaked in 1992 when he was the best heel in the entire business and one of its top workers and headlined numerous house shows against Sting. But just as he really hit his stride as an all-around performer, injuries began breaking him down. Rude mainly feuded with Steamboat over the U.S. title in early 1992 in matches that were generally considered good but not great. And like, I literally wrote a note here that to me, it was like, this is crazy because that IronMan match on that Beach Blast is so great.
It's so great.
Now we do not have, tapes, and we were not in the arenas of them doing their house shows. And so at that point in time, especially you look through Dave's lens where there was Flair and Steamboat, that it was like known that you were going to go to a Flair Steamboat show and see a 4-star match.
Yep.
I'm taking it that didn't happen, but they showed out on the pay-per-view, man. They absolutely did. So what may have been his best match of his career was on August 12th, 1992 with the finals of the G1 and NWA World Heavyweight Title Tournament, losing to Masahiro Chono in 29 minutes and 44 seconds before a sellout 11,500 fans at Tokyo Sumo Hall. At the time of Rude's death, he was the only foreigner ever to go to the finals of a G1 tournament.
Well, the whole way up until 99, he was the only one. That's really impressive.
Yep. As an aside, Dave says, before the Sumo Hall match, and I need to say that this is a gem. Before his Sumo Hall match with Hashimoto, when he delivered his, quote, "what I'd like to have right now," end quote, speech with Medusa, who already had a name made for herself in Japan as a pro wrestler, as his valet. So he comes in there with some cred. The crowd cheered wildly, knowing it was Rick Rude's pre-match mic performance, but not knowing what he was actually saying, which was peppered with some racial slurs.
Oh my gosh.
By the time the finals came around 2 nights later, word had gotten around as to what he was actually saying, and the crowd response had changed completely to where he got every bit of the heat the routine would have gotten in the United States, which checks out with your nuclear crowd heat that you had mentioned at the start of the match for the finals.
Yes.
So Dave says Rude and Chono ironically followed the match of the year caliber performance at Sumo Hall into a worst match of the year winner at Halloween Havoc just 10 weeks later on October 25th, 1992, where Chono lost via DQ to retain the title at the Philadelphia Civic Center. In between, Chono had been dropped on his head with a too-low version of a tombstone pile driver by Steve Austin.
What? I didn't even know that.
With the result being eerily similar to Austin having the same thing happen to him from Owen Hart 5 years later.
Dude, mind blown on that one. That's so weird how this stuff works out.
It really is, dude. And the crazy thing about this is that it's not like Steve had bad things to say about Owen, especially upon his passing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's widely known that like they had heat,
big heat,
and you know what I mean. And it was Steve was like, "Owen, where were you? Like, why weren't you checking in on me, etc." And I'm not gonna. I don't know these people, but I'm just going to assume that if Steve was that much of a stickler for why didn't you check in on me to Owen, he must have done that to Chono.
I agree. I was getting ready to say that. Yeah, I agree.
We don't know. We do not know.
No.
But there you go. So that's why that match sucked.
Okay.
So Dave
Dave
said Chono was clearly never the same after that point and wasn't close to being ready for the Philadelphia match. So what WCW did was literally book the best match of Rick Rude's career again. And Chono had a broken neck.
Gotcha. Okay. That's so WCW.
Yeah, right. Rude and Sting were tearing houses down with classic U.S. title matches, with Rude being Sting's bumping machine until being sidelined with 2 bulging discs, one of which pressed a nerve, and Watts, in charge of WCW at the time, decided that Rude had to vacate the title because he was going to be out of action for several weeks. Rude was somewhat upset at that, but more upset when Watts, with his old school values, cut Rude's pay once he wasn't going on the road and wrestling, which left Rude furious once again since he was injured in the ring. So Rude literally has this back-to-back while he's also doing the best work of his career. He goes from working the main event with the new world champion to be the bumping machine for the Warrior to being in the main event with WCW's literal version of the Warrior, which is Sting.
Yep.
Being a bumping machine, and both times injured, both times the promoters say, hey, thank you, bye.
Yep. It's crazy. It's just they always end up picking the wrong guys in the end.
Yeah. All right. So nice little cut point here, John. Why don't you take us into our 5th match highlight that we have for Rick Rude?
Yes, our 5th match highlight comes the following year at Beach Blast in 1993. This is an IronMan challenge. It is Dustin Rhodes versus Rick Rude for the U.S. Heavyweight Championship. So we have a 30-minute IronMan match, which we talked about before whenever he did the match with Steamboat, how that match was so good. So again, they try to rebook another good Rude match, and we get this. So again, I was excited because I just watched the Steamboat match, and this was for the vacant U.S. title. And this one was much, much flatter in the beginning. Rude loves a damn rest hold, but he ends up getting the first fall after a rude awakening around the 10-minute mark. And literally there's nothing else that happens the rest of the match. It is just rest holds, rest holds, rest holds. And with minutes left, Ventura says that the hand dropped for a 3rd time on Dustin, but the ref missed it. And we didn't even see it either because the cameraman never got it. So we literally have no idea whether or not Ventura was lying to us or if he was actually working here. So Rude stayed ahead 1-0. Rude was whipping Dustin's ass, and then Dustin comes out of nowhere with a Johnny Bakeshow special with a running bulldog, gets the pin to tie things up with 3 minutes to go. The scoreboard that they showed in the blow up here was just so 90s. It was so perfect. I loved it. Dustin hits the DDT, covers as time expires, and they call it as a draw. The title stays vacant. There's no sudden death. There's nothing. That's just it. And this sucked. Dave Meltzer gives it 2 stars.
So I cleared my throat, and you can leave that one on here. Because, John, this was WCW Rick Rude version of the Shawn Marty Jannetty Royal Rumble 93 match.
You're right.
Okay?
So right. It is.
Like I was a child, and I thought that this was just the cat's meow. And I'm a grown up, and I've seen great things, and this was not the cat's meow. And I'd like to formally apologize to you on the air for this one.
I appreciate that.
And especially because it's Rude and Dustin. And so I know you had to be fired up, man.
Oh, as soon as I saw it, I was like, yeah, we're going to get an awesome match here. And that's not what I got.
Yeah.
I got bear hugs and chin locks.
You did. And you got a 1-1 draw and a 2-star match. And Cage Match didn't even have enough reviewers to give this thing a rating. So it's like I dropped the ball. Yeah, I'm sorry. All right, man. So off of that, Rick Rude eventually returns to the ring, but in the ring was never the same. By this point, his reputation in wrestling was strong enough that it really didn't matter. He was scheduled to finally win the NWA World Heavyweight title from Ric Flair on September 19th, 1993 in Houston, Texas at the Fall Brawl pay-per-view show. Interviews were taped, and at the time when WCW would tape worldwide and do angles for months in advance, in Orlando that summer, with Rick Rude holding the belt and talking about upcoming defenses, long before the Flair match was finally announced, everything was in place, and then the NWA Board of Governors, such they were, were upset with WCW for making a title change without consulting with them first and voted to refuse to allow the change. This led to the final WCW NWA split. So this is historic.
That is pretty big. That is really big.
On television, after Rude beat Flair for the same physical belt that had been the NWA World Title belt dating back to the mid-1980s, it was announced as quickly and quietly as possible, while still fulfilling the directive of court rulings, that Rude was not the NWA champion. It was stated that the WCW International, an organization separate from WCW, had created a world title, so this was to be referred to as the WCW International World Title in the United States, and simply the WCW International Heavyweight Title in Japan, when Rude lost and regained the title in 2 matches with Hiroshi Hase before losing it to Sting on April 17th, 1994 at the Spring Stampede pay-per-view show in Chicago at the Rosemont Horizon. John, our final match highlight, brother. Go ahead.
Yes, this is the Sting versus Rick Rude match from May 1st, 1994 from Fukuoka. And this is the career-ending match. These guys were actually having a great match. And Sting with some foreshadowing here with the face paint with the white and black. The spot where Rude his career ends due to injury happens around the 7-minute 45-second mark in the match. So when Sting splashes over the top rope onto Rude, you can instantly see the platform. As soon as Rude hits it, you can tell that he's in serious pain. It's remarkable that he was able to push through this to the end. And he took some amazing, insane flat bumps immediately, especially with the running clotheslines, which we need to just note how insanely awesome the running clotheslines are because they're so good. But he had blown his back out completely and was literally bumping on it, doing suplexes. It's insane how injured he really was that he was able to do all of this. And what sucks too is that this match was awesome. Awesome. So it's crazy that this is one of Rude's greatest matches of all time. But Dave gives this 3 stars, and he's got a blown out back. A done forever. Career ended.
And this is the Shawn Michaels bump, dude.
It is. It's literally the same thing.
The untrained eye does not know. And the worst thing about this is that when I was a young fella, this is Rick Rude, who I wanted to lose every match he was ever in, because I was 9. And when I heard that he didn't really beat Sting because of whatever the dust up was, I was so excited. I was so happy. And what sucks is that, again, you get context, and yeah, I wish that never happened, man, because this is absolutely terrible. For the Dave Meltzer point of view, the final match of Rude's career as an active pro wrestler took place 2 weeks later after that Rosemont Horizon match that we had noted before, with his wife expecting the couple's second child, Marissa, who celebrated her 5th birthday 1 week after her father's death, which, if you are a Podski listener, that confirms John and I's speculation that Rick Rude was the other wrestler that Dave had alluded to in the excellent preamble that he had written to that week's issue. That is confirmed that she just celebrated her 5th birthday. They induced labor so that he could be there for the birth. She was born, she being Marissa, on the morning of April 27th, 1994. He had to leave the country later that day for Japan, where he was scheduled to win back the world title. While wrestling Sting at the Fukuoka Dome before 53,500 fans on a show headlined by Antonio Inoki versus the Great Muta, Sting did a running over the top rope dive. Rude caught Sting, but the way the ringside area was structured had a board elevated maybe a foot or so above the ground surrounding the ringside area. In going down, catching Sting, Rude's back landed half on the board breaking when the top half had nowhere evenly to break the fall, blowing out the C4 and C5 vertebrae. Rude blamed Sting for being careless where he dove, and there was tremendous heat between the two, which some feared could turn into a problem when Rude returned eventually in late 1997, because that heat intensified due to things said during depositions in Rude's later lawsuit against WCW over the incident. Rude got up and won the title with a pile driver and a knee drop off of the top rope after a distraction from valet Lady Love, who worked his corner in those days only on Japan tours. Rude never wrestled again, and it was a few weeks after the fact that the title change was rescinded and given back to Sting due to the controversy surrounding the finish. Rude, injured, was, in very bitter fashion, gone from WCW. He was 35 years old, and in the second year of his biggest contract he ever signed, his wife said, and then it basically ended. That just killed him. He was a great entertainer, and it really hurt him, and he couldn't perform. Even at the risk of injuring himself seriously, he'd have tried it again. Again, that was a quote from Rick Rude's wife. Aside from testifying in the McMahon trial, Rude was out of wrestling for the next 3 years and living in Tampa. There were constant rumors that he would return, most of the time to the WWF, but he had made out on a huge settlement from Lloyd's of London and had a lawsuit ongoing against the WCW due to the career-ending injury, and returning to the ring would kill both. So that's why he sits on ice. So, I don't mean to say that this is a great segue, but I say sit on ice. So let's segue over to figures, brother.
Yeah.
Let's talk figs for a second, man. Yeah, so Rick Rude, he comes to prominence in an interesting time where he's there for some of the most iconic figures of all time, but I feel like his figures are really niche. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do. I agree.
So why don't you tell me what your three favorites are? I'll go to mine, and then we'll get back to his career.
Yes. So coming in at number 3 for me, I have the Hasbro. Now, the Hasbro was the first time posed for that mold. And the reason I have it on my list is because the Hasbros are so important to figures today, and Hasbros have to be on the list. If you don't love Hasbros, I don't know how you are a wrestling fan and or a toy lover. I don't know how you're not, because they're so iconic. Coming in at number 2 for me is the classic Superstar Series 13. The reason it's number 2 for me is just because the molds that Jax does for the face, they're so spot on. And to think that they are 15 years old plus, and they look like they had that good of technology back then to make that face look that good. And the only my issues with the classic Superstars is that they're not in scale with any of the figures you got right now. So you just throw them out the window. They were perfect in their own world, but they don't always fit with today's figures. But my number 1 is the Coliseum collection by Mattel, Series 2. I have that in the collection. It is the modern recreation of the LJN figure, and I just think that you can't get anything better than an Ultimate Edition. And if you're going to have one figure in your collection, especially with today's figures and how modernized they are, that should be the one that you get. What are your favorites?
Excellent, man. So my number 3 is the Mattel Rick Rude Legends Series 2 figure.
That is a good one.
SummerSlam 1990 pants.
Yes.
And the reason I have this on here is this is the first Rude figure we got with short hair.
Yes.
And that face scan is so great with the smooched lips and the stash. And his pants have his own face on them.
I have a great nugget about this figure. There is a UK exclusive that is different from the US release.
How so?
It is colored different. I believe he has a different tan, and the pants are slightly colored differently.
I had no idea. So is that one of those?
It's a 2-pack.
Is there value on that? Is there big time value on that?
Yes, because it's a UK only exclusive. So it comes in a 2-pack. We do get the Warrior One in the States. That
So
one
they
released.
put them together in the UK.
Yes, it comes with a steel cage.
Wow.
Yeah. Uh-huh. The big blue cage.
Wow.
An elite 2-pack.
I
The cage. Yep.
So my number 2 was your number 1.
Mhm.
And that is the Mattel Ultimate Edition Coliseum Collection Series 2. What I have is this figure might still not be ripped enough,
It might not be.
but it is the most perfect posable and playable version of late 80s Rude.
I
And
agree.
it's an excellent figure, dude. And so for you, you're not wrong having it number 1. But my number 1 is the LJN Rick Rude. So what I have here is that this is the best looking figure with the worst pose possible for a guy that did a neck breaker as his finish.
It is. It is so bad. It's one of the it's a good figure because it's Rick Rude, but at the same time it's one of the worst ones because you can't do shit with him.
Exactly. The likeness is spot on, dude. The pants, it could have been better, I guess. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But overall, it is such a great figure. It's just him with his hands on his hips doing literally the dance pose.
Yes.
Doesn't help when you're trying to give Hulk Hogan a rude awakening, right?
Right. Can't do it.
Right. But it's because it's a black card LJN. And it is one of those that are just so unicorn.
Yes.
I got that as my number 1, dude. I did say that this one blows the Hasbro, which I actually am really fond of because of actual Fig Fed memories of him using that, driving punch out of the water. And the reason is the likeness.
Right.
I think the likeness on the LJN destroys the likeness on the Hasbro. You are absolutely right in having the Hasbro in your top 3. And we didn't compare these ahead of time.
No, we didn't.
So I'm happy you did because people would have killed us for not if one of us didn't.
Yeah.
But that's the reason that I have the LJN up there is the likeness is so crazy. And my number 2 being the Ultimate is because it's based off of the LJN.
Yep.
That's it.
That's a big call.
All right, man. So get back into his career. So Rick Rude is done wrestling. Eventually, he returned to ECW in 1997 in the role of a television announcer who was there to screw with Shane Douglas until turning on Tommy Dreamer. At about the same time, the WWF hired him to work television tapings as a, quote, insurance policy, end quote, with Shawn Michaels and Hunter Hearst Helmsley in the original incarnation of DX. Before he stunned both companies that he was working for simultaneously and without a contract by signing with WCW. And I should note that this came as a shock to both the WWF and ECW, as both groups thought that this wasn't even an option because of his hatred of the company and the lawsuit that's still going on.
Yeah.
So as part of Rude's new WCW deal, he dropped the lawsuit. They settled the lawsuit. Okay. And the WWF did attempt to bury him on the way out, having Downtown Bruno dress up in a suit like Rude to give the impression that literally anyone could have filled his position.
Of course they did.
Of course they did, right? So this is where we take the more melancholy turn. So this is going to be the end of Rude's career and into his passing. So Rude died on April 20th, 1999. Mentioned at the beginning, mentioned that in the middle, mentioned that at the end. Rude had been attempting to get out of his WCW contract since at least December, presumably to wrestle in the WWF. At one point, he threatened Eric Bischoff that he'd just show up in the stands on the WWF television broadcast, not realizing that his contract prohibited that, and due to all the legal problems between the two companies, the WWF wouldn't have allowed it either without a release from the WCW because we are mid-war right now.
Big time war.
So there had been bad blood over Bischoff signing Rude from WWF for $300,000 a year on a 3-year deal in a notable coup in late 1997 with Rude appearing sans beard on Nitro earlier in the evening and then appearing later in the evening with a beard on a taped Raw from 6 days earlier. But like so many others, never pushing him meaning they didn't push Rude after they'd signed him. Although realistically, it's hard to fault Bischoff on this score, as he really did try to groom him for a heel announcer role, which turned out not to be his forte. Rude had told friends that he was going to confront Kevin Nash, claiming Nash had also promised him a larger announcing role. Before signing with WCW, Rude had been working WWF without a contract and was negotiating with Bischoff for weeks for the right time to perform the jump. Rude was brought in originally to be a heel NWO television announcer based on his work in ECW. However, once given the shot, it was something that he was clearly not cut out for. Dave says his ECW work, while initially funny, ran out of steam by the second or third week, and Paul Heyman only kept him in the role long enough to create an angle to turn him heel and to get him out. Paul Heyman, creative genius, dude.
Creative genius.
Then, now, forever. Got it. The bad blood was such that at Rick Rude's viewing on 4/23, Rude's mother asked Bischoff, who came with his wife, when he showed up, to leave, which Bischoff quietly did. There had been acknowledgement from friends of Rude and others that at about the time he started trying to get out of his WCW deal, he made a contact with the WWF and tried to set up a comeback, pitching them on the idea of a run against Steve Austin. The two were friends and sometimes tag team partners in the early 90s when they were in WCW together as members of the Dangerous Alliance. The holdup, as noted before, besides being under contract to WCW, was that he had received a 7-figure settlement from Lloyd's of London, claiming his 1994 broken back had ended his career as an active wrestler. The settlement, combined with the lawsuit against WCW for what he claimed was his career-ending injury, and again, that wasn't settled until he signed with WCW, was the reason that when Rude had worked as a manager, bodyguard, insurance policy role in ECW, WCW, and WWF over the past 2 years, again, this is written in 99, so from 97 to 99, whenever he was involved in anything physical, it was very limited. So him being the insurance policy, he literally stood there to flex his muscles.
Gotcha.
When they brought him out with the NWO, he literally stood there to flex his muscles.
Okay.
And this is because of the lawsuit settlement, Lloyd's of London deal. There you go.
Okay.
So Dave does say, though, he could be on offense. So, that's not to say there wasn't a punch thrown or anything like that. But because of his agreements, he was not allowed to be put in a position where he would have to take a bump, since he claimed the back injury prevented him from doing that part of the pro wrestling job description.
Okay.
So no bumps, no rude awakenings, you know what I'm saying? So he could throw a punch. Rude had attempted to get WCW 2 and had talked with WWF, although the talking never really got past preliminary stages, pay off Lloyd's of London on his permanent disability claim, which would allow him to return to the ring as an active wrestler. Side note on Lloyd's of London here really quick. So Lloyd's of London, which, and again, this is 1999, which no longer will insure pro wrestlers, paid off similar claims to Kurt Hennig and Joe Laurinaitis, who is Road Warrior Animal, who both, after taking several years off and collecting on a large disability payment, ended up returning to the ring. Dave notes that Laurinaitis' deal ended up where he claimed he would be able to function as a tag team wrestler, but not as a singles wrestler, which is why he hasn't been booked in any singles matches in the WWF, and is the reason why the WWF never was able to go anywhere with the Hawk versus Animal feud. That's why you had Puke.
Okay, gotcha.
According to friends, Rude has been training intensely for a comeback, even though no such deal was specifically on the table. He was about 255 pounds and looking as muscular as ever at a considerably higher body weight than during most point of his entire career until a recent bout with pneumonia. And this is how you know this is the gas.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
I don't mean to be speculative here, but until a recent bout of pneumonia caused him to drop 40 pounds.
I can't believe that. You got pneumonia and you dropped 40 pounds.
Right. That's the Ozempic pneumonia.
For real.
At the time of his death, he had gained some of the weight back and was in excess of 235 pounds. During his career, his weight generally varied from as low as 205 off steroids, which is when he was doing the family planning deal, to about 235. So when he was training to come back, he was 20 pounds heavier than the highest point in his career. So Rick Rude would have came back in 1999 as 2002 Triple H.
Absolutely. 100%.
That's it.
Man, that's wild.
Speculation on his death has been rampant. And the only reason we're going to talk about this is because contemporaneous of the time, and it is relevant to sort of put a bow on everything later. So there's no real speculation here, but I did want to make a couple of notes. So there's been a series of incidents going on the last 2 months. On 3/1, so on March 1st, when Rude was brought to Chapel Hill, North Carolina to do Backstage Blast, he literally passed out on the set between on-air segments, and his performance was said to have been so bad to the point that it was debated between segments about even allowing him to continue on camera. So concerns are starting 6 weeks before his passing.
Okay. All right.
His next assignment, the 4/5 Backstage Blast in Las Vegas, he missed due to pneumonia. So bad showing, not there, legit reason. I mean, he has pneumonia.
Right.
And then 4 days later, near his home, so this would have been April 9th, he was arrested on a DUI. So people are really concerned at this time for him, right before he passes. So Dave says, within wrestling, much of the talk links it to GHB, a drug that's known as liquid ecstasy, which from several sources is considered an epidemic within the company, and many claim throughout pro wrestling. This is the Steven Regal drug, by the way.
Yes.
If you remember the Bruce Pritchard, Steven Regal deal where he was passing out on the table, etc. That's sort of why I brought this up, because this was a thing. This was a real thing in the business. The drug was very popular in pro wrestling and nightclubs in the early 90s before it was taken off the market. A new form is more readily available, and Blue Nitro was an example of that. I remember seeing Blue Nitro in GNC.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, dude, like stock shelves. So that was one of the ready to buy, ready to drink things that were right there. It was a very accessible deal at that time. By no means was this, black market stuff.
Okay.
And it's popular among bodybuilders and strippers because it induces quick and deep sleep and allegedly increases the secretion of growth hormone while sleeping, thus leads to burning more calories while sleeping and thus cutting body fat. Because of how GHB breaks down in the body, even if this was the case, it probably will never show up on a coroner's report, nor, as noted on ESPN's Outside the Lines, check the archives, would human growth hormone. The natural speculation, given his physique, would also gravitate towards speculation about steroids, which frequently elevate blood pressure and, in extreme cases, can lead to heart attacks. There is no indication Rick Rude ever used HGH, and Rude's steroid use was well documented. And this is where I learned something, and maybe I can impart this knowledge to you, John. So as mentioned before, Rude was a reluctant witness against Vince McMahon in the 1994 steroid trial, in which Vince was acquitted.
Okay, I did not know that.
I didn't either, man. His testimony didn't include any earth-shattering revelations, more so just reinforced the fact that steroids and the business went hand in hand. And while McMahon might have made suggestions about his physique while off steroids and planning to have a family, he did not provide them to Rude, nor was it a condition of his employment. That's wild, dude. I didn't know that he was actually on the stand there.
I didn't know that either.
All right, so this is it, brother. So Rude's death was covered as a major story every half hour on rotation on the ESPN News Channel, along with regularly repeating segments on the death of wrestlers, concentrating on Brian Pillman, with an eerie scene of Rude at the 10-bell salute on the Raw for Pillman from Outside the Line show, as well as the same segment airing all day as the cover story on SportsCenter. CNN and Headline News also covered it. It garnered a lot of media play in the Atlanta market, and newspapers in the Twin Cities also ran stories on his death, but there was little other national coverage. There were two different media outlets in Japan who also covered his death, speculating on steroids as a cause and bringing up Dynamite Kid and Davey Boy Smith's recent health problems as being analogous to this event. Check the archives, man. Been there before. Aside from the obits in the Atlanta and Minneapolis media, it didn't receive much other national coverage. Rude's rough exterior camouflaged the person who had talked at length to other wrestlers about his three children, Little Rick, Marissa, and Colton, who were 8 years, 5 years, and 21 months old when Rude passed. He loved to hunt and fish, particularly with Henning and Rick Steiner. Friends like Sharky or Bret Hart noted in his passing that he's one person that you'd like to have most as a backup in a tough situation because you wouldn't have to worry if he'd be there for you. And I finish this Observer issue with a quote from his wife again. He was a great entertainer, said his wife, Michelle, who was 33 at the time of his passing. He was nothing like the person in the ring. He was a great family man. He lived for his kids, and he ate and slept wrestling.
So with that concludes our bonus episode on Rick Rude. We hope you enjoyed this because this is something that we're doing for you, the listeners, when we hit our milestones. So don't forget to subscribe. So when we hit our next milestone, which we're very close already, we're already halfway there. By the time this drops, we might even be there. So, and since the Great American Bash Show is right around the corner, if you subscribe now, we will be able to hopefully give you the Eddie Guerrero show to pair up with the Great American Bash Show of 2004. So we got a lot of good stuff coming up here with Eddie, and we could even dovetail that into the bonus show of Eddie so you have something to pair with it, so you have more content for you, even more news and notes for you. So we thank you all for listening, and with that, we will see you next time on the Podski.